Greetings, everyone, and welcome to CSBA's Budget Webinar. Our governmental relations staff is on hand today to break down all the important elements of the governor's 2022-23 budget proposal and to answer questions from CSBA members in a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. In order to prepare for that, if you have a question you'd like CSBA staff to answer, please use the question icon, which for most of you will be near the bottom of the screen. We ask that you use the question icon, the Q&A icon, not the chat icon, to submit questions. CSBA staff will look at those questions behind the scene as the presentation goes on, and then present them to our GR staff at the end of the PowerPoint slides. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn you over to Dennis Myers, our Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations. He will introduce his team and begin to break down some of the elements of the governor's proposal. Dennis?
Great, thank you, Troy. It's great to be here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As you can see, here are our panelists here from Government Relations team, and then also including Troy. I'm Dennis Myers, Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations. We also have Cheryl Ida and Erica Hoffman, who are legislative advocates who share the budget responsibility. And then Chris Reef we'll hear from as well, who is our legislative director. So let's get started. We'll start at the high level of just kind of giving an overview of the budget and we'll talk about where Prop 98 is. You know, knowing about Prop 98 isn't something that is going to be on the test, but it's good to know because you can see that there is real growth, not only in the state general fund, and you've been hearing that a lot in the press, but also in Proposition 98. So you can see here that we've got an increase in Prop 98 guarantee. The second bullet references how much. We're talking about serious increases in the Prop 98 guarantee, you know, approaching $8 billion in a year-to-year difference. And so, you know, you're going to hear a lot about, you know, you probably already have heard a lot from the last 24 hours from the governor and others about historic levels and this. Yes, it's historic. If it's $1 more than the current year, it's historic, but these are significant increases. And I think last time when we talked, you know, back in May of last year, when we did one of these webinars, just think about where we started a couple of years ago when we thought the floor and the bottom was going to fall out of the state budget, and then where we are today. I mean, it's a shift of 20 plus $billion of real ongoing revenue into Prop 98. Because when the state budget is adopted, that kind of sets into place expenditures. But since July 1, revenues for the state general fund have really been, you know, really outpacing, I think, everyone's expectations. So when the governor's budget is introduced in January, he looks back a year, looks at the current year, and then projects forward. So if you see there, the third bullet down, where we talk about total cash available over the 3-year budget, that's what we're talking about, is adding those numbers together. You get about $16 billion that's available, some of it one time, some of it ongoing, but nonetheless, we're talking about significant amount of money that's available, far more available than we thought, you know, even 18 months ago. Again, Prop 98 is in test 1. What this means is that Prop 98 gets a specific share of the state general fund. So whether, you know, enrollment growth or inflation doesn't come into play here, just as the state general fund is growing, then Prop 98 benefits from that growth on almost a dollar for dollar basis. And so just at the end there, you can see that chart that shows the difference in between K-14 and K-12. Prop 98 is a K-14 calculation. And so you can see the K-12 number, then you can see the difference that is available there, you know, between K-12 and K-14. Next slide, please. Now let's look at cost of living increase. So I think also in the press, you've been hearing kind of a lot of high-fiving over the COLA. In the current year budget, if you recall, let's just kind of rewind a little bit. Current year budget had an LCFF COLA of just over 5%. What that was a COLA for the prior year and the current year put together. And then the legislature and the governor added an additional 1% to that to get to the 5.07%. For special education, it was the 2-year COLA without, the 1% bump that was given to LCFF. And then other categorical programs had a smaller COLA. This current budget that was proposed yesterday, the governor's looking at a COLA of 5.33%. So this isn't showing any additional benevolence. What this is the calculation. The index that is used right now is showing inflation for public agencies at 5.33%. It's always backdated a little bit. So the inflation that we're experiencing right now in local agencies may be more than that. But nonetheless, this really is just, it's for inflation. And so, your purchasing power may be flat because inflation is at, a little over 5%, or it could be worse if inflation actually is running a little higher than 5.33%. So the reason why we're talking about this is because there's a lot of talk about COLA, but, it really is just, this is what statute is calling for. And it's a large COLA by no means, we're not trying to downplay that, but it really is what's required in statute. Next slide. We've also heard the governor talking about the Proposition 98 reserve, public school stabilization or system stabilization account. The reason why we're watching this is, many of you who've been around for a couple of years have heard us talking about Prop 98 reserve. You've also heard us talk about the school district reserve cap. So what this chart shows is the contributions that are being made because of requirements that are in the Constitution, that when capital gains are a significant portion of the growth in personal income tax or the state general fund, there's requirements that are made to contribute funds to certain reserves, including the Prop 98 reserve. So these contributions were made in the prior fiscal year, and they're also required to be made in the current fiscal year. And the governor is also looking at the fiscal year coming up for 22-23 and saying there's going to be another requirement to put money into that Prop 98 reserve. How that money gets spent is up to the legislature in the future, and we can cover that in future webinars. But right now, the assumption is that in this fiscal year coming up, that the total amount in the PSSSA will be about almost $10 billion. So now let's go down to the reserve cap bullets there. The requirement also is that when that reserve balance equals 3% of the K-12 share of Prop 98, then that's when this reserve cap triggers. The reserve cap basically says that school districts can't have in assigned and unassigned reserves more than 10%. However, because of our lobbying and our being CSBA mainly with some of the other management groups and others, we got that law changed to where the reserve cap, yes, gets pulled into place. The trigger gets pulled because of the balance that's in the reserve account now. However, because of our legislation from 3 years ago, it does not apply to small districts, 2,500 students or less. It does not apply to basic aid districts. So take those 600 or so districts off, does not apply to you. So what about the other 500 or 400 school districts that are out there? It applies to assigned and unassigned reserves. What those are is basically reserves that are kind of established by your staff for certain things. So it's in your budget, and it may have just been part of the budget for, your 3% reserve for economic uncertainties, things like that. Yes, those are assigned or unassigned. How you then make sure that this reserve cap, either you spin down to that reserve cap, or if you want to have the board vote on these reserves, they then become committed and this reserve cap doesn't apply. So that's when we're talking about this, we basically say, well, it either does not apply to you because you're small or you're basic aid, or you make it not apply to you by having the Board of Education just simply say, here's the list of 10 things that we're setting this money aside for, and you put the money over there and it does not apply to the reserve cap. And that's something you really need to talk to your staff about, because it could be the list that you develop. It could be future unknown expenses, or it could be school bus replacement, or it could be technology. It could be a list of things. And if your needs change, you just revote on that list. And that's how it works. And so really it doesn't apply, but there is some administrative and board action that would have to take to protect you from this trigger affecting you. Lastly, on the next slide that I'll cover is you're also hearing a lot of conversation this time. Go ahead and move the next slide, please. You're hearing a lot of conversation now about the state appropriations limit. It's called the GAM limit. That's why we have it in parentheses there. Basically what this is, this has been around for probably 40 years now, and it limits the growth in the state general fund. And we're actually, because the state general fund is growing so fast, it is now, we're not just bumping up against it. In the past 40 years, we bumped up against it, but now the state is actually exceeding it. And so what these three bullets talk about is the excess revenue, when this applies, then what the Constitution requires is that money go out, half to taxpayers, half to schools. And so what happens here is last year at this time, the legislature was looking at $16 billion overage for the GAN limit. And so that's what this next bullet talks about, is $8 billion of that was scheduled then to go to schools. Because what this was like a forward estimate. What the legislature did is they did a couple of things. One is they sent a lot of money out the door in tax breaks. And so that reduced the overage, but then there was still this amount that was owed to schools. And so what the legislature did is just kind of reappropriated funds, moved things around, and pretty much kind of just zeroed out the overage of the state appropriations limit to where schools, it looked like at budget adoption, were not going to be eligible for this GAN limit payment. It's only happened, I think, one other time, probably in the late 1980s. However, in the January budget, the governor came out and said, well, despite what the budget did to try to zero that out, it looks like what the state is looking at now is they're over enough to where schools would be looking at potentially $2.6 billion. So the issue here that will be figured out between now and the May revision, and then between the May revision and budget adoption, is one, are there other places the legislature can move money around to zero that out? But if not, then it's what kind of allocation to schools, where would this money be allocated? For ADA, perhaps. We're talking about perhaps, wow, how about pensions, things like that. So that's kind of a stay tuned, but we wanted you to know that this is being discussed. It is a possibility. And then likelihood, I guess that's subject of another webinar, but it is something to watch because it still does apply. The state is taking in enough money in the state general fund now at a fast enough rate that they're actually having to deal with this, which is a good thing for us if we can actually capture some of that funding. I'm going to be quiet for a while, and we're going to turn now to more of the specifics of the budget and get into the specific proposals. And here we have Cheryl Ida, one of our budget lobbyists. Cheryl.
Good evening. So just a little bit on what Dennis was just talking about, because I want to highlight one thing. It is an election year. So if we do have surpluses, maybe more will go out in the Golden State redemptions. Who knows? We'll see. But that's something to think about if you're eligible and have been eligible in the past. Next slide. So one of the things that we were actually very pleased to see, and this is something that we've been talking about up here for a while, and I know that everyone is aware of this, is declining enrollment is coming, and it's coming quickly, and it's probably much more of an issue given what we have problems with ADA, especially during a global pandemic. And so what the administration has proposed is to either allow you to use current year, prior year, the higher of the two, which is current law right now, or you can use the average of the 3 prior years in a rolling average. This should soften that blow that we see at a fiscal cliff. And so this is something that we've been talking about. It was a conversation back in December. There was a hearing about it. And so it's been explored. Looks like this is something that they're going to adopt. And we got clarification that this isn't something that would be temporary, that this could be an option moving forward should it be adopted. There's also the way that this is currently drafted in the 8 pages, or excuse me, in the budget summary, is that this would only be for school districts. And so there's going to be conversation about how to address this with charter schools. And the cost of these policies would be about $1.2 billion in Prop 98. Next slide, please. There also has been changes in independent study. The details we're going to get ironed out a little bit more back in February, excuse me, moving forward in February. But what we know so far. So as you recall, back at AB 130 last year, required that every school has to provide independent study. Various methods in which you can do so, but in order to receive apportionment, you have to have in-person and you also have to provide independent study. The budget proposes to streamline some of these programs just because you can use two different types of programs, traditional independent study, but also, traditional independent study, and then also course-based independent study. The way that we traditionally count for ADA in independent study is we do a time work value of an assignment, but they are willing to use instructional time to also count for ADA, and then also provide additional flexibility in that timeline to be able to collect that independent study plan. That has been really challenging, especially during quarantines. I'm sure everyone is aware of that. So we'll get the more details on that and make sure to report that out to you once we see the language in February. Next slide, please. Transitional kindergarten. So everybody is aware that this is something that moved forward last year, and it's going to happen over a 3-year period beginning in the budget year of 22-23. We are seeing a rebench of the Proposition 98 guarantee. If you recall, this was always something that I was very concerned about because we didn't get that in language, but now that we're seeing this for sure, that they are going to rebench, we are currently at 38.02% of the total general fund in Prop 98. So to be able to accommodate these additional students incoming into the system, it's going to be rebenched and add an additional 639.2 million for those additional children, and then also 383 million to reduce that class size ratio from 12:1 to 10:1 over the next couple of years. So happy to see that. We're very thankful that they held their commitment to be able to provide that additional funding. However, there still is not additional funding for facilities for this proposal in this policy and transportation. So that is something that we will continue to bring forward with the administration and the legislature. So as I just mentioned about transportation, while there is not additional transportation funds to pay for existing transportation issues, they did provide $1.5 billion in 98 over 3 years in order to buy electric school buses. The way that they envision this right now, but we'll get more details when trailer bill comes out, is providing at least $500,000 per school bus. And this is going to go with priority towards low-income students, youth foster care, the way we look at unduplicated, but also for small and rural LEAs. And this is intended to cover the cost of the bus, the charging stations, and also other transportation needs, including training. There's also going to be a work group with various entities to be able to look at how they can streamline the process for training for school bus drivers. We know that this continues to be an issue and a shortage area. And we are looking at it. We actually just worked on a letter with many of our other colleagues to be able to align our system with the federal waivers to allow for drivers to not have that requirement of the special license for large school buses, but it's the commercial license, commercial driving license, so that we can get these bus drivers in since we have such a bad shortage. Next slide, please. School nutrition, usually a pretty sleepy area of the budget, but we are seeing significant investments in this area. As of last year, we are seeing additional $596 million in 98 to be able to provide universal meals. So that's 2 meals per day to any student that requests it. Doesn't matter about income, and this would be beginning in budget year. Schools are going to be required to participate in the federal meals program, so you can maximize that dollar, and you're going to have to apply by June 30th of 2022. There's also going to be $450 million over 3 years to upgrade school kitchens. I think the idea is to provide scratch kitchens, and then $3 million in order to provide for the school breakfast and summer meal startup program. A couple of things in this area that we're not quite sure this is actually going to meet the mark and the real need of what we have. It's kind of hard to tell right now because we have the federal waiver altogether. But we think that dollar amount, that 596, might come up short. So it's going to be something that we're going to be working on with the administration to hopefully see a better number in order to really meet the need so that we're not falling short in this area. Additionally, that 450 million for that 3 years to upgrade kitchens, we do commercial kitchens right now, or most people do, well, many people do, where they have a centralized kitchen. For $450 million, you might be able to get more of like a heat and go type of kitchen, but the scratch kitchens that they're looking at, this is not quite enough money to be able to do that at every single school site. So we're also going to let them know about this, but and use of one-time funds. Next slide. School facilities. We saw an infusion of funding in school facilities last year of general fund, and this year we're seeing the same thing. $2.3 billion in the core funding of new construction and modernization. I would point out that right now we have about $3 billion on both the unfunded and the acknowledged list in the school facilities program. What that means is that you have two different lists of projects that have not been funded yet ultimately. They've just been acknowledged. We've received your application, but there's no funding left in the existing program. Seeing this amount of money for the core programs is great. It's always good to see a general fund infusion without having to go out for a bond. We're still working on a bond though. I mean, definitely not going to let go of that one, given that the need is definitely there. But 2.3 billion doesn't quite meet that 3 billion of existing need. So worth noting. There's also $30 million that's going to be ongoing for the Charter School Facility Grant Program. This is an existing program that runs out of the California School Finance Authority for charter schools. However, this is going to be a new component for them to allow to do modernization and upgrades in their leased facilities. Next slide. And I'll hand it off to Erica.
Thanks, Cheryl. Appreciate it. This, as you can tell, it's a very long list of programs that are within the governor's budget. So we've split them up. I've got the second half of these programs. The governor does provide additional funding for the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, the Elop program. Every time I hear that, I keep thinking about a bunny rabbit. I don't know why, it's the acronym. As you know, the governor did provide funding last year to start this program off. And what it does is it provides funding to LEAs that receive concentration grants. And it provides additional funding to allow greater access to comprehensive after-school programs, summer school enrichment programs, and various supports for students. This budget for the 22-23 school year, the governor would provide an additional $3.4 billion in ongoing general fund monies for the Elop grant funds. And when you combine those with what was provided last year, it becomes a total of $4.4 billion. There's also funding, though, he's provided to kind of expand the programs a little bit. He's got $937 million in there in one-time funding to support program infrastructure with a focus on the arts and music. So basically, it's how do we bring arts and music programs into these after-school, summer school enrichment programs. One of the things the budget summary does acknowledge that implementation of this program for the size and scope of it can be challenging. It has, and we all know it is challenging for local districts, but they're trying to put an emphasis, and supposedly this will come out in trailer bill language, that is going to encourage schools and districts to consider partnering with community-based organizations and other local entities to try to scale this program up. So we'll see how that works. The next slide, please. The teacher pipeline. Last year, as you all know, that there were a lot of programs that came forward in order to expand the pipeline for teachers, provide professional development. This is kind of a continuation of that. So in this budget, the governor does provide about $54.4 million, both in general fund and in Prop 98, to support further efforts to hire teachers and substitutes. He provides an expansion and increased funding for waiving specific teacher exam fees, for waiving credential fees. He provides $10 million for grants to develop and expand some of the teacher prep programs that were started last year. He also provides both Prop 98 and some general fund money to reestablish, and for those who have been around long enough, like I have, personnel management assistance teams. These go back probably at least 10 or 15 years. And what they were teams through the County Office of Education to help school districts and assist them in improving hiring and recruitment practices, and especially in light, the shortages we have and how can they get streamlined at a local level. So he's looking to try to reestablish those to provide that more direct assistance to school districts on the personnel side. The funding will also, or the budget will also provide funding to establish career counselors for educators at the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, and this will be part of the general fund money. And if you could move forward on the slides, please. Thank you. And this is where we get into with being at CTC, the general fund side of things. But they're also providing funding to support the staff work and other things that need to be done with regards to all the grant programs from last year, the fee waivers, that sort of thing. They are looking to establish through about a $900,000 general fund augmentation to CTC to do a PR program to highlight the value and benefits of entering the education career and entering the teaching career, especially for K through 12. And so it's to try to put a PR focus on getting people to become teachers, which is something I think would be a smart thing to do as we're trying to expand that. What's interesting, and this happened just today, so this is hot off the press, just so you all know, the governor did propose yesterday in extending the statutes that authorize credential holders and permit holders of how long you can substitute teach in one assignment. We're providing in the budget to extend that for up to 60 cumulative days for one assignment. In a quick read of the executive order the governor just signed today, it would double that to 120 days. So that's what we're hoping. We're looking through the details of it right now. But literally, this is something that came out yesterday, and they're already talking about, because of the impact on schools, the teacher shortage, of being able to expand the single assignment issue up to 120 days. So that's going to be a good thing for schools. We can move on to special ed. As you know, last year, the governor provided quite a bit of new funding for special ed to up the rates under the AB 602 formula for your students. This year, he's providing even more additional funding. Under the budget, they're providing $500 million going to, that's Prop 98 fund, to the special ed funding formula. And this is in addition to the COLA. So we're getting $500 million. We're proposed to get the 5.33% COLA, which is about 140 million. But you combine all that together and put it in the 602 formula, and you're looking to increase rates. According to the Department of Finance, it'll go up to about $820 as the base rate under the AB 602 formula, which is absolutely fabulous in trying to address the costs and the needs for special ed students. There's also some programmatic and program changes that are going to be attached to this. One of them being they are proposing to amend how the funding formula is calculated. Right now, it's based upon total enrollment at the Selpas level. What they would do instead is base your funding at the LEA level. So what is your special ed enrollment at the LEA level rather than the Selpas level? However, funding would still go to the Selpas. And the reason for doing this and what they're looking at, as you know, over the last couple of years, there's been great talk about changing the formula and changing how we do special ed. What they're trying to provide through this is some transparency at the local level so that you as school districts and your communities and parents would know what is actually the funding level that the LEA receives for special ed, even though it does go to the Selpas. So that's where this is. Haven't seen the detail yet on this language. And that's, as Cheryl said, it's the devil's always in the details of what this language looks like. But according to finance, all they're looking at doing is just changing the calculation to be an LEA-based calculation versus a Selpa-based. But the funding stream would still remain the same and still go through the Selpas. So that's something to think about. And we're going to be looking at that very closely. They would also be combining the two extraordinary cost pools that we now currently have for special education, combining that down to one cost pool and simplifying the formula. One of the other changes they're looking at doing is allocating the educationally related mental health services funding directly to LEAs. It's how it's determined. It's how it goes out. Just send it straight to the LEAs is their thought. They're looking too at developing, and this ties to the transparency level, ties to the whole issue of bringing parents into the discussions and the formulations that you currently have for all of education, for your gen ed, basically, under the LCAP, but also making sure that special ed is included, is coming up or developing some sort of special education addendum to the LCAP. And basically it would be to support inclusive planning and promote cohesion by specifically linking special ed and general ed. It's school districts, you need to educate all your kids and making sure that your planning processes and your local control processes affect both of those. It's going to be a while before we actually see what this looks like. There'll be direction language within the trailer bill to get this developed. So I think there's going to be a lot of comment, I think, over the next couple of years as this gets developed and comes into the lexicon for the LCAP. One of the things they are pushing is to continue the development of a comprehensive IEP so that there's a little more standardization. And then finally, one of the issues that the governor has raised this year is looking at potentially an alternative diploma for special education students. And then a work group of how to explore alternative coursework options for students with disabilities. I mean, one of the things we see when it comes to special education students are just the numbers that can't reach the requirements for high school diploma. But what would a high school diploma look like for special ed students? And I think that's part of this discussion. It's kind of been a longstanding issue as we look at performance of school districts. So these are things that, all of that being said, that will come out within trailer bill language, and we will take a very close look at all of that. Let's go on to early literacy. Early literacy has always been an issue for the governor, and this year he's looking to tackle it by providing one-time Prop 98 funds. Basically, he's looking at $500 million over a 5-year period of Prop 98 money that would go to high-need schools to hire literacy coaches and reading specialists to focus both on the classroom and one-on-one small group intervention, what you as districts can come up with in order to provide that additional help to students to get them up to speed on their reading. What I love too, though, is he's also looking to provide some one-time money in grants to local education agencies to expand multilingual school or classroom libraries to try to get materials in that kids could be able to use for reading. The next slide, please. Finally, we're getting down to the college and career pathways. This has been an issue, and it ties to many themes that are throughout the governor's whole budget. Looking at employment and growing industries and what we need to bring people back into things like teachers and education, healthcare. And this is some funding that he's providing directly to K-12 education. This doesn't go through the community college programs, but he'd be providing $1.5 billion in Prop 98 funding over about a 4-year period to provide support for districts to develop additional pathway programs, specifically looking at technology, which would include science, green technology, things of that nature, kind of STEM, but a little shade different, but also in healthcare, education pathways to try to get students, who's your favorite teacher? Why don't you emulate them and become a teacher? And then also climate pathways. One of the big pieces throughout this whole budget for the governor, as you saw with the transportation issue and the green buses, is addressing climate change and addressing climate issues. And how do we make our mark in California? And so trying to include a more specific climate pathway for students to look at. And then finally, he would provide $500 million also over a 4-year period to support dual enrollment opportunities for our kids and getting them into colleges and your local community college. Part of what this support would be is also academic counseling support, things of that nature, but trying to increase the number of students that are able to duly enroll in programs both in high school and college and still meet their graduation requirements. The next slide, and I'm going to hand this one over to Chris.
Thank you. So, although we're very, there's a lot of stuff in this budget, and we're, generally pleased with much of it, there are still a number of fairly significant unresolved issues. Most concerning for us is the issue of base funding. Although we welcome the governor's proposed LCFF COLA increase, there's enough money in one time, or I should say one time, there's enough money for other programs that could be funneled into an increase in the base in the outgoing years, but it has chosen not to do that. So we're going to continue to advocate for that, recognizing that that will help all boats rising. On pensions, right, we have the additional dollars that were provided in past budget year and the current budget year, but it ends at the end of this budget year. So what we were hoping to see in the governor's budget was an additional allocation given the additional revenues that we are seeing to help cover those additional costs. Unfortunately, we don't see that. That's going to be also another priority for us and other advocates to really push to get that included. Otherwise, we're going to see essentially a 2% increase in the overall costs related to staff and employment costs. And that will really cut into the overall COLA that we see in this proposed budget. And like Cheryl said, in terms of how we are focusing on, or we're entering into the implementation of universal transitional kindergarten, we face real logistical and infrastructure issues at the district level. Many schools, districts, and as many of you know, don't have the requisite facilities, right? Transitional kindergarten, especially serving 4-year-old children, have to be developmentally appropriate, right? Smaller chairs, smaller bathrooms, other appropriate facilities needs, and we don't see that. And as we start to see the rolling out of the 4-year implementation of universal kindergarten, these types of infrastructure pressures are going to become real. And so we would very much like to see a greater investment in providing of more money for TK facilities or kindergarten facilities especially. Another area where we continue to advocate and we continue to bring this up and will continue to advocate for is the ongoing need for additional transportation operational costs and funding. As many of you know, right, we many years ago was eliminated predominantly, and many districts struggle to provide the adequate amount of transportation. And now that we're facing increased costs as it relates to the late start bill, which will take effect in this July, this is going to become even more pronounced. And if we can't provide transportation for students, there is a great concern that some students might just not be able to show up. And so these are going to be 4 areas that are going to be priority areas for CSBA and others, and we'll continue to advocate for on behalf of all of our members. Next slide. So happy to share with you this great opportunity for many of you to learn more about the budget, where we go much more in depth, and we do it by county or by region. So we do this in conjunction with capital advisors and AXA and some of our other advocacy partners like the Small School Districts Association. And so they want to encourage you to kind of click on that link, or we'll share these slides later, of course, but you can also Google Capital Advisors Budget Perspectives Workshop, and it will pretty much take you right to the link and you can sign up. They have links for most counties, and so they will start next week and will go for about the next week and a half or so. And so please do look for your county to and then sign up for that. And we do a much more kind of granular, detailed, deeper dive into the governor's proposed budget. And now I'll turn it back to Dennis.
Thanks, Chris. As we're closing out on slides, the next 2 slides are just, kind of little advertisements here about upcoming opportunities for advocacy. So the next slide, please, looks at Legislative Action Day coming up. So we are moving towards an in-person Legislative Action Day in Sacramento at, I can't say the state capitol because they've moved away from that, but we're still looking at that at March 15th. You can go to the website there. You can see at the bottom to register. There's no registration fee, but obviously paying for the cost to come to Sacramento. And we advocate on some of the issues we're talking here, like base funding, things for special education, transportation, but also some of the other core areas as well. Secondly, we have a new thing that we're working with AXA on, and this is coast to coast. This is our first trip together with the governance teams. This is school board members and superintendents going to Washington, D.C. in late April, during a time when the Congress is actually going to be in session, to lobby issues that are real specific to California. So we're going to be hooking up with members of Congress, but also our state senators, and then key members of the administration as well, in and around the White House, Department of Education, and some of the other federal agencies that we deal with. So we want to remind you of those two lobbying opportunities as well. And so now, I mean, let's go, I guess, to Troy Flint and see if there's any questions. I know we've been answering a lot of questions in chat and in the Q&A. So I don't know, Troy, where what the process is right now to see how else we can get some of the questions answered, or if there's anything that any of the presenters wanted to add.
Well, why don't we start with that? Is there anything that we didn't cover during the presentation that we want to add on now based on the questions we already saw from the audience, or something that occurred to you more recently?
Nothing from my perspective. I don't know if, Cheryl, is there anything that you want to add? If we could just kind of go for, down kind of the line of presenters. Cheryl, anything that you want to add that came to mind, or any of the questions that you want to address specifically?
I didn't have anything specific, but I just wanted to, it came up a couple times that I was helping answer. We were both answering about what the prior year means for the declining enrollment formula over the 3-year rolling average. So it's 3 prior years. So if it were to begin in 22-23, which is what is being proposed, it would be 19-20, 20-21, and 21-22. So the 3 prior years.
I'm glad you said that, because I think I went back too far. So it does start with 21-22.
It starts 22-23 because it's budget year, right? That's when trailer billing which would take place, and then the 3 prior years from that would be 19-20, 20-21, and 21-22.
Okay, that's what I was missing. The fact that it takes place in this next budget year. Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's big to know.
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm seeing some questions popping up right now, so I can help answer that too. And then if other folks want to chime in as well. Someone is asking if there's any pension relief from the state on behalf of school districts. There is pension relief for the state, by the state, but not for schools. So this is the last year that we are going to have any kind of buy down from the state. We did not see anything proposed in the budget right now. That does not mean that's where that conversation stops. Obviously, it continues to be a very high priority for us, and we continue to advocate for this on all fronts, both houses and the administration. And it's one of our largest priorities. We know the impact that it has on your budgets, and this is something that could obviously help everyone that we want to see move forward.
So Cheryl, related to that, a question just popped up in the chat, which I think will be relevant for most of our members. And this member asks, what's the best language to use when advocating with our local legislators to understand that an increase to the base is beyond just the COLA that's being talked about? They seem to get conflated or confused. So how would you hammer that point home to people you're advocating with?
It'd be really helpful if I could see the question. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit visual
So I think if we phrase it another way, what they're saying is, in the media and elsewhere, the COLA that was granted is being treated as some huge bit of generosity that is going to fundamentally change the financial fortunes of schools. How do you enlighten them on the fact that this is not the case?
When you're just funded at COLA, that's not an infusion to the base. When you're funded at COLA, that's keeping your existing buying power for the same exact dollar amount that you had in the prior year. Now, when you fund a beyond COLA, then you do have that additional power. It's the difference of $1 being $1 versus $1 being $1.50, right? If we got that additional 50 cents, that's what actually makes a difference.
Thank you for that. And then we have another question. Erica, this is up your alley as our SPED specialist. Will the special education monies go to Selpas or to districts directly?
I was just answering that one. The funding will go directly to Selpas as it's currently done. That doesn't change. The structure of your SELPA and how you all come to agreements, especially in a multi-district SELPA, that doesn't change. All that changes is how the funding amounts are calculated originally. That's all that's being proposed to be changed. Now, until I see trailer bill language, I'm hoping that they're right, because this is what they keep telling me. But when we see trailer bill language, we'll have a better thought. But as of now, what they're proposing is they're changing how the funding is calculated. So it's more LEA based. So you've got a clear number for each LEA of this is what you're generating. But the funding will still go through the SELPA as is currently provided under current law.
Thank you, Erica. Someone asked whether we will send out a recording. Yes, we will send out both a recording as well as a copy of the PowerPoint deck to everybody who registered for this event, and you will receive that by Thursday at the latest. We have another question about career and technical education. The member is wondering how much is the increase for CTE?
CTE does not have an increase. Last year had an increase of $150 million ongoing. What you saw Erica present earlier is for a completely different program that's structured specifically for the areas of STEM, environmental education, and it's not meant to go through the traditional CTIC or strong workforce pathways. We'll see how that actually plays out and how they plan to get those funds out. It's planned to be for K through 12 and administered through the Department of Education, but the details are not much beyond that. So we'll see how it actually goes forward in trailer bill language.
And another question that I think would apply to many of our members is whether there's any funding to cover for COVID testing and absences. I know, Cheryl, that you said there's no specific funding earmarked for these purposes, but Dennis, maybe you can talk a little bit more about what kind of advocacy we're doing to help protect districts that are struggling with teacher shortages and maybe experiencing more absences or hopefully not having returned to remote learning to some extent. What are we going to do to protect districts in those cases?
Well, I mean, there's so many answers there because part of it is money, part of it is personnel, part of it is, you know, can we submit forms like a J13 to take care of some of those issues? So it's all of those conversations that the team here is having with other groups, with labor also, but also with the administration for just those things. So we just saw, you know, a couple hours ago, a new executive order on, you know, trying to help with the staffing to make it easier to have substitutes in the classroom. So all those kind of things. And we're continually hearing through our pacers and through others, conversations that are happening locally and some of the difficulties that districts are having. And we're feeding that off in conversations that we're having with everybody here. So, I mean, it's all those things. What kind of relief would help administratively? Also, is there money available that can help with things? You know, the administration has told some folks today that, hey, they've distributed 10 million personal testing kits, and there's only a few 100,000 more that they need to get out to county offices. And we're all scratching our head going, man, it seems like we need like another 10 million of those. It's all of those things, Troy. So, I mean, tell your story locally, but then get that to us, get that to AXA, so that we can be advocating on all of these, because a story that may be in one part of the state, we know translates statewide. So just keep telling us your story so we can pass those along up here.
And then hot off the presses was the executive order about giving some flexibility to get people in the classroom to help with the staffing shortages. And one member just wanted to confirm that he heard correctly that substitutes who are not credentialed teachers can be in the classroom for up to 120 days. Can we talk about what the executive order says on that and any other relevant issues for dealing with staffing shortages?
My quick cursory read of the executive order, and we're going to be sending out an email standalone blast. The person has to be credentialed. So what it says is they have to have an undergraduate degree and receive a cleared criminal background check, and then they can get their emergency credential to serve as a substitute teacher. And then there is adjoining with that executive order, the governor provides and a doubling of the number of consecutive days that a substitute teacher can serve or a credentialed person can serve in a single classroom from 60 days to 120 days. So that's actually a fourfold increase over the last year and a half or so, where previously it was a 30-day limit. It was extended to 60 days in a previous executive order and then codified via the Budget Act. And then now it's being doubled by the governor via this executive order for 120 days.
And that includes, not having to go to the CTC. So this would be something that you would certify locally on some of those teachers as well. So I mean, the intent is to really try to speed up that process so you can get more subs in the classroom during especially through this, what we're going through right now with Omicron, to get through this bulge with with a lot of teachers being out sick. And so that's why there's a start and a stop date on that. The intent isn't to lessen quality, it's to make sure that there are people who do meet the standard, but we don't have to wait for the state approval. You can do that locally.
We also have a question now about mental health. What, if any, new resources in the budget are addressing student mental health and issues and wellness solutions?
There's not really anything specific. If you look at a lot of what was provided last year, that's all multiple year funding. So basically what they're doing is they're waiting for it to still continue to roll out. What we're going to see a lot of this year, though, I think, is last year was more of a planning year, or this last year has been more of a planning year of how the programs will roll out. So we're going to start actually seeing what that rollout is and how the funding will be then hopefully appropriated to schools. I think a lot of it will still be grant level funding. So that's something that we're looking to see over the next couple of months.
Okay, and a follow-up, is there anything specifically addressing the mental health of school board trustees or teachers, staff, the rest of the workforce?
Not necessarily trustees. Some of the teacher issues, as far as teacher mental health, when you look at some of the community mental health programs, that is, would include teachers. So we've got that piece of it. But as I said, a lot of it, the programs from last year were development and what would they look like and how would they deal with it, especially when it came to things for students. It's one very specific issue. For teachers, there are references through some of the newer programs from last year, but nothing that I've seen massively specifically, and nothing that would specifically go to school board members. That would be more in the community mental health areas.
New question, how is ELOP going to be impacted by the new proposed budget?
The governor's provided increased funding for Elop. Last year, I think it was about $1 billion. He's provided an additional $3.4 billion for Elop this year.
Erica, can you explain what Elop is, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Elop is the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. And that's the program that provides funding for those with concentration grants to provide access to comprehensive before school, after school, summer school, enrichment programs for students. And originally, my understanding is the governor had talked about this last year's budget of ultimately being close to a $5 billion program. They provided $1 billion, which is more for planning and that sort of thing. This last year, in the proposed budget, he's putting in about $3.4 billion for program expansion, for program implementation, excuse me, and which would give you about 4.4. So there's a little still more room to grow in here, but it's basically to now get this program off the ground, to get it implemented, to get it moving. There's still going to be a lot of questions, I think, for districts on things like transportation, of how to get.
Sorry, the thing
kids.
that I would add too is that this funding is meant to go through art and music programs is what they're trying to implement with this additional funding as well. Whatever their focus is and how that's actually going to be divvied out is yet to be determined, but that was noted in the budget summary as well, is that they wanted to have that specifically addressed and integrated into the existing program.
Yeah, the 3.4 billion, there's about a $937 million bump for art and music emphasis. So it's, I mean, it's really what they're looking at is full expansion of these programs into very large. I mean, ultimately they're looking at, 9 hours for kids during summer school.
The expanded learning opportunities grant program, for many of you who have ACES programs, will find that the statute is very much mirrors the ACES program. So many of your districts who actually are offering ACES can kind of follow in the same path in some respects. When the governor first announced this program, he used the term kind of high intensive tutoring, right, to address the lost learning opportunities that children experienced during the pandemic. But we are very much aware that even though the dollar amount sounds large, right, $5 billion does sound like quite a bit of money. When you spread that over all the districts that could qualify, the money doesn't go as far. And so this will be an issue of implementation, and encourage many of you to kind of talk with your school staff and your district staff to see how that is going, because there's going to be some real challenges with implementing this grant.
Thank you for those responses. We also have a couple questions related to independent study. One person is speaking about the difficulty of collecting independent study work from students who are absent due to COVID and the way that unfairly penalizes districts. Is that being addressed in the governor's budget or in other conversations?
Yeah, so part of the reason why there's any what's being addressed in the governor's budget is to allow for instructional minutes to also be able to be counted towards independent study. So right now in traditional independent study and course-based independent study, the way that you count for ADA is by your time value of your assignment. But if you can't collect the assignment because they're sick, which is what the question is about, and I think that's what the recognition of this is about, they're also going to allow instructional time. So if they're tuned in, if they're they're logging on, I think that we don't have the trailable language right now, but that's what I imagine they're going to be able to count towards instructional minutes to be able to collect ADA.
Thank you, Cheryl. We also had a follow-up question on the substitute credential related to the executive order that was released today. The question pertains to who actually provides the emergency credential. Is that something that still has to be done, approved by the CTC as opposed to being done locally?
So I don't want to speak too prematurely as we're still reviewing it, and we're going to again send out a summary of the EO later, hopefully later tonight, if not early in the morning tomorrow. But as it looks right now, yes, you would still go you could still go through the CTC to get the emergency credential. However, there is language to allow districts to offer that credential independent of the CTC. Now, what's unclear, and we're taking a closer look, is whether or not these are districts that already have credentialing authority, or if it expands to other districts. And I just encourage you to keep an eye out for our summary that we'll be sending after sometime in the next, hopefully 12 hours.
Thanks, Chris. There's also a question about COVID test kits, the shortage that people are very familiar with. Is there any indication from the administration that there's going to be a greater influx of districts to alleviate the shortage that some districts are experiencing?
I'm not sure who to direct that one to. The state today was telling us with all the different education groups, they've sent 10 million tests out through the County Office of Education. I know the county offices have been getting it out as best as they can. They did not indicate more to come right now. What they indicate is that those testing kits were part of the testing system, that working through healthcare, working through the state testing system, the PCR and other tests is the other part. So at this point, we're pushing for more. I just don't know if the state is going to be providing that versus you working with your county offices to order more and to get those done quickly as well. I mean, it's another reason why, you know, we need something more than cost of living increase, because, you know, there are COVID costs that aren't being covered here.
We have another question related to the expanded learning opportunity funds. Specifically, the member says, this year, many districts stated they would not be able to spend current year Elop funds and meet the 8-hour a day, 30 additional days requirement. Funding increased significantly in the 2022-23 year. Do you think districts will be able to spend these funds effectively?
I think the hope is that they will be able to. For a number of districts, what they're going to run across is what are your local costs? And will this funding cover it? And we don't know that yet. Because depending upon where, you know, where you live in the state, your baseline costs are different. It's still being determined. And hopefully within the next month or so, we'll have more and better information for you, especially on a base rate for districts and what that impact would be. It's one of those things that we still have to wait for trailer bill language, and there's still a lot of calculation that needs to go behind this language.
Okay, thank you, Erica. And for now, this appears to be our last unanswered question. What recourse do districts have in terms of conducting contact tracing when the county director discontinues contact tracing? So I guess what options are available for a district acting on its own to implement or augment a contact tracing program?
You can probably tell by most of our faces, we're not quite sure. I mean, it's.
Why would they do that? I mean, contact tracing is still important, right? I know there's a difference between now on how close you can be and if you test versus, you know, how long you need to be in quarantine. But you know, Anna, email us that question and we'll try to see what the answer is, and it'd be an answer back out to you. Maybe not to all the participants, but I mean, you stumped us on that one.
Yeah, that's one we're going to have to go to. I'm going to have to go over to Department of Public Health and ask them, because
Right.
that's a health question. And if they've got counties that are just not doing contact tracing, that.
And I do
there's
believe we have
different
vendors
issue.
that do offer that in some form, but we would need to really verify what their capabilities are to give you a complete answer on that.
Sure.
So seeing no more questions, I think we will get ready to adjourn. Again, we will send out the video of this recording as well as the PowerPoint slide. We encourage you to keep an eye out for our budget workshops. We also have a budget info page on the website, which we are building out with information as it becomes available. You can look at a summary of the state budget, various statements by CSBA President Dr. Susan Heredia, and other relevant information and advocacy resources. We'll continue to develop that. We'll be in touch and keep you informed. Thank you for joining us tonight. Until next time, take care.